Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. Today we continue our series on Forgotten Fathers with one that, well, we don't even know who he was. He is known in history as Dionysius the Areopagite. But it turns out that there is just no way that the documents attributed to him could have been written by Dionysius the Areopagite. And so we call the author of the documents Pseudo-Dionysius, because someone wrote those treatises, but instead of putting his own name on them, he wrote them as if they were from someone who lived 4 centuries earlier. So first of all, who was the real Dionysius the Areopagite? In Acts chapter 17, we read that St. Paul was preaching in Athens, and some of the teachers of various philosophical schools were, as the text says, engaging him in discussion. Then he starts talking about the resurrection, and we know from reading the early apologists that this was a disturbing topic to the pagan philosophers. So when Paul starts talking about the resurrection, the Athenian philosophers drag him before the Areopagus. The Areopagus was a council of the city of Athens. The word Areopagus is actually a name for the hill of Ares, named after the Greek god of war. I'm told it's at the foot of the Acropolis, and that now there's a street there named after Dionysius. The city council met on this hill, and so the council itself takes its name from the place where it met. And one of the possible reasons for dragging someone to this council was to get him executed. So it's not all that different from what happened to Paul in a lot of places. Paul then preached to the council. I see you have an altar to an unknown God. Well, I know this God. He happens to be the only real God. Your idols are not gods, but there is a real God, but only one. And then Paul gets back to talking about resurrection. The text tells us, some people scoff and walk away. Others say they want to hear more. And some became believers from Paul's preaching. One member of the Areopagus Council was converted that day. As a member of that Areopagus Council, he's called an Areopagite. Acts 17:34 says, But some did join him and become believers. Among them were Dionysius, a member of the court of the Areopagus, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Now, unfortunately, we never hear about Damaris again, but Dionysius became a source of fascination for centuries to come. So, the real Dionysius the Areopagite was a contemporary of St. Paul. He was a convert of Paul's preaching in Athens, and the historian Eusebius tells us that he became the first bishop of Athens. Another tradition says that Dionysius was the one who brought Christianity to Paris, and that he was martyred there during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. This would have been between the years 117 and 138 AD, and this legend says that Dionysius died at an age of over 110 years old. It's interesting that there are so many men in the early church named Dionysius, especially since the name Dionysius is the name of a pagan god. It's the Greek equivalent of the Roman god Bacchus, the god of wine. Now, I like wine as much as the next guy. Well, more than some guys, but less than others. But I wouldn't name my son after the pagan god of wine. So one can only assume that all of the later Dionysii of the church were actually named after this Dionysius the Areopagite. There was even a pope named Dionysius, and at least 2 other bishops, one of Alexandria and one of Corinth, not counting the original as Bishop of Athens. In fact, Dionysius of Rome was pope at the same time that Dionysius of Alexandria was the metropolitan of that city. That was in the 3rd century. And Pope St. Dionysius had to correct the Alexandrian Dionysius on his theology. But I digress. The point is that there were 2 bishops of major cities at the same time, both named Dionysius. The problem, though, is that none of the documents that bear the name Dionysius the Areopagite could possibly be written by a man who was a contemporary of St. Paul. The first time we even hear of documents written by this Dionysius is in the 6th century, almost 500 years after Paul's preaching in Athens. These documents, attributed to Paul's convert, were then used by one side in a controversy over Christology. But the other side dismissed them as authoritative and maintained right from the start that they were not actually written by the 1st century Dionysius. It was argued that no church father before the 6th century had ever mentioned them, that they seem to have just appeared out of nowhere in the 6th century. Among the documents is a letter addressed to the Apostle John on the island of Patmos. That would mean the letter, if genuine, was written about 95 AD. But the same author refers to the Gospel and the book of Revelation as ancient tradition. In another place, Timothy is described as still a youth, but in a document that would have had to have been written when Timothy was quite old. The documents describe both liturgy and monasticism in ways that are much later than the time of the real Dionysius. And the author uses language that seems to come from the controversy over Christology that led to the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The works of this Pseudo-Dionysius definitely show the influence of Platonism and later Neoplatonism. For example, that evil is not a created substance, but rather the absence of good. In fact, for this author, that is so much the case that pure evil cannot exist, since it would have no substance. Therefore, all evil has at least some good in it, but is a corruption of it, or a falling short of what the good was created to be. So the author shows influence not only of Plotinus, who wrote in the 3rd century, but also the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus, who wrote in the 5th century. In fact, the author of these documents claims to be a student of one Hierocles, who he says was a disciple of Paul. But what he says he learned from Hierocles is actually from this Proclus. And the way he describes Hierocles sounds a lot like the philosopher Proclus. So the real author of these documents was probably a 5th century student of the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus. We can also say that he was probably from Syria, since he has descriptions of liturgy that sound like what was going on in Syria. And we know that there were Syrian philosophers in Athens in the 5th century. So what we have here is a 5th century Syrian philosopher, probably living in Athens, a student of the Neoplatonist Proclus, and a mystically oriented Christian, perhaps somewhat influenced by Gnosticism, or maybe Origen, posing as the 1st century convert of the Apostle Paul, and writing under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite. In all, there are 4 theological treatises and 10 letters attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite. I'll mention just a few of the most important. First, the Divine Names, which is addressed as though it was written to Timothy. It's about the names for God, but in this document, the primary name for God is Thearchy, which could be loosely translated as Godhead. The point the author makes is that all the names for God don't really describe God in his essence, but describe the powers of God, or attributes of God. In a treatise called The Mystical Theology, the author takes this idea that the names of God don't really describe God per se, and says one must get beyond names for God, and even get over needing to know things about God, because talking about attributes of God only gets us so far. And whatever we can say about God, God is actually that times infinity. Now, this is a common approach, often found in the East, called apophatic theology, or as it's known in the West, the via negativa, that is, the negative way. The idea is, you can't really know anything about who God is. We can only say what God is not. And by saying what God is not, we learn something about who God is. But from there, the treatise gets even more esoteric, with themes like this. One must dive into the truly mystical darkness of not knowing, since this darkness is more luminous than light itself. And here we see evidence of one of the pioneers of Christian mysticism. And these documents of Pseudo-Dionysius are going to be extremely influential, especially on the mystics, and I'll say more about that in a minute. In his document, The Heavenly Hierarchy, the author outlines the ranks of angels, seamlessly weaving that into an overall cosmic order that includes the hierarchy of the church's clergy as well as our sacraments. So where do you think we got the idea that there are 9 ranks of angels broken up into 3 orders of choirs? Well, we got it from Thomas Aquinas, of course, but where did he get it? He got it from Pseudo-Dionysius's Heavenly Hierarchy. Now, in the year 827, the Byzantine emperor in the East sent a copy of the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius to the King of France, Louis the Pious. They were translated into Latin, and later better and better translations were made, and this would make these documents even more influential in the medieval West than they would be in the East. And so, the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius were significantly influential on the likes of St. Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century, as well as John Scotus Eriugena in the 9th century, who made the first translation of his works, and medieval scholastics like Hugh and Richard of St. Victor, St. Albert the Great, and St. Thomas Aquinas. Also, the medieval mystics, including St. Bernard of Clairvaux, the Franciscan Jacopone da Todi, and one of my personal favorites, St. Bonaventure, and then St. John of the Cross. Eventually, the authorship of these documents was seriously challenged in the 15th and 16th centuries. As a mystic himself, Pseudo-Dionysius described sanctification and salvation in terms of theosis, or deification. And although that process of theosis is aided by intellectual study, the spiritual disciplines, and the grace of the sacraments, it is not completed until one reaches a state of mystical union with God, which goes beyond the intellectual, and which comes through contemplation and, if God should so choose to bless the contemplative, an ecstasy that is comparable to the beatific vision. So, what's the takeaway from this brief introduction to an anonymous father? First of all, the writings of the Church Fathers are not like Scripture. One of the criteria for a document's inclusion in the New Testament is authorship. That is, it had to be known to have been written by an apostle or a first-generation disciple of an apostle. This means the first-century documents that are in our New Testament have a certain apostolic authority, an authority that the 5th century author of these documents wanted for his own writings. One of the letters claims the author was in Egypt at the time of the Passion of Jesus, and he could see from there the cosmic events described in the Gospels. If these details are fictional, and if the author of these documents intentionally wrote under the name of a historical person, passing himself off as that person, well, then there is an element of deception here. And that, for the Church Fathers, would have certainly disqualified these documents from being included in the New Testament. But whereas the Church Fathers would reject a known forgery from consideration for the New Testament's table of contents, such a situation does not necessarily disqualify a document as useful for the Church after the time of the New Testament, if the content is considered worthy. In any case, the truth is that everyone who used the documents of Pseudo-Dionysius, everyone who was influenced by them, seems to have accepted the authorship as authentic. Another takeaway is that Pseudo-Dionysius is another example of the fact that church fathers are not infallible, and their writings are not to be taken as inspired in the same way that sacred scripture is. So, for example, an error in one part of a document doesn't necessarily mean that other parts of the document are not useful. So here comes the caveat. Not everything in Pseudo-Dionysius is exactly in line with church teaching. For one thing, he takes this idea of the hierarchy of angels to an extreme and ends up sounding a bit Gnostic, saying things like, knowledge itself must be passed down to humanity from the top, one level at a time, and that it degrades as it travels down the hierarchy. And so, in the end, his writings have been known to lead people astray. And the final takeaway is that one has to be careful with mysticism. A lot of heresy hides under the disguise of mysticism. And some of the people who used Pseudo-Dionysius used these documents as a springboard to launch themselves right outside the boundaries of orthodoxy. And many of those people were mystics. So I'll link a couple of these documents in the description, but if you read them, just check what you read against the Catechism before you believe it. Next time, on The Way of the Fathers, Boethius. And by the way, that will be the last of this interim series on Forgotten Fathers, and after that, we dive into our new series for 2025 on the Doctors of the Church. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings. Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. And the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.